Hi there. Thank you very much, Daniel, for a beautiful, kind introduction. I also want to thank the Center for Jewish Studies, Natan Paradise, Marielle Coulter, and the congregation and the rabbi for having me as part of this lecture series and into this space. I'm going to talk about serious topics, but I'd like to begin with an old joke. Maybe some of you know this joke. And the joke it goes like this. There's two old friends, two guys sitting on a park bench in silence, and one of them looks over at his buddy and he just says one word, and he says, "Oi." And the other guy looks back at his friend and he looks at him for a second, and then he says, "Oi." And the first one repeats, "Oi." The second one says, "Oi." And they go on like this, and finally, the first one says, "I thought we agreed not to talk about Israel." So, this is a talk about Israel and Zionism and human rights, and for many people in the Jewish world and beyond, that's kind of a double oi, right? It's kind of a doubly fraught conjunction of topics. That was the case also in 2018 when we marked two different important anniversaries, as you can see up here, right? The founding of the State of Israel and the founding of the modern human rights movement with the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For many people today, it's hard to imagine that this is more than a cruel coincidence, right, or a strange irony, because Zionism and human rights are often viewed both inside and outside the Jewish world as things fundamentally in tension. And this is a lecture about history. I'm not going to be talking about contemporary politics, but we always engage these questions in the present. And one of the things that led me into the writing of this book was some of the intense fighting about these subjects and how they connect. On parts of the Jewish left today, and I only mean parts, Zionism is viewed at best as a kind of clannish tribalism, and at worst as a kind of extreme racism. On parts of the Jewish right, again, parts, human rights themselves are seen as de facto anti-Semitic. Many on the right view human rights as something which have become a weapon directed uniquely against Israel. One prominent American Jewish intellectual said recently that human rights were the worst thing to happen to the Jewish people since World War II. And in the middle, between these extremes, there's a small and shrinking group of people who call themselves liberal Zionists, who are often accused by both sides of being disloyal, right? Either disloyal to the Jewish people or disloyal to the values of human rights. My question, and the one I'm going to look at today, is how do we get there? Was it always this polarized? And is it a coincidence that both, and I'll explain what I mean by this, both Zionism in a certain sense and the international human rights movement have entered a state of crisis today? The book I set out to write was intended to answer some of these questions, and I wanted to go back and look at what Jews were thinking in this moment when human rights came alive after World War II. And this led me to a kind of different approach and a different history than I even expected to write about how we got human rights. That unknown story, I'm going to argue to you, has implications for how we think about the Jewish past as well as how we think about the past of human rights. In the book, I tell the story in terms of individual life stories that kind of intersect with one another. And I focus on 5 people. I call them the lawyer, the activist, the rabbi, the philanthropist, and the diplomat. These are the pictures up here. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the lawyer. Because his story is one which encapsulates a lot of the questions I've just outlined for you, as well as it's just a pretty interesting story. But before I talk about him, I have to go back to 1948 and talk a little bit about human rights. And when we go back and look at it, we face a puzzle. The idea of human rights has a long pedigree, and if we want, we can reach back in history to talk about ancient sources and ethical values in Judaism and other traditions. But as we have human rights as a moral language and as ideas about international law as well, that really came about after World War II. That's when the UN created this Universal Declaration of Human Rights and an idea of projecting law above the level of nation states to protect humanity. Instead of relying simply on constitutions and citizenship, there had to be a way to protect some basic fundamental human rights of people. And that also meant limiting sovereignty and stopping states from committing violence against their own people or other people. At that same moment, as the United Nations is proclaiming this new vision of international law and human rights, it's also saying that, in fact, nationalism is a good thing. We need states, we need nation states. Sovereignty is a good thing. And instead of large empires, we're going to divide the world and imagine that each people should get a place of their own, right? And in that sense, it says, the UN says, that we need a world of states, so the Jews should have a state. It's only logical that we create them. And the way to protect humanity is to give them discrete places they can live, where they can rule over themselves. The question for me, thinking about this moment, is why did Jews seek their own sovereign nation state at the same time as they were also working to change all of sovereignty and humanity? How is it that these two different things are happening at the same time? And how is it that Jews are engaged in what we might call two different responses to modernity? The simplest answer to this naughty question is to say it's different people. Why would we assume that the same people are doing these things? And the simplest way most people think about the stories of Zionism and human rights is to say, sure, some Jews choose nationalism and others choose internationalism. Some Jews come out of the Holocaust and they choose land and guns and they say we need to protect ourselves. And other Jews come out and say, no, we need to think about rights and law and something different, a different way of approaching the world. In other words, some Jews choose the universalism of human rights and others choose the particularism of the nation. Excuse me. That, in a nutshell, is the story that most people tell about Jews and human rights. And it's a story I thought I was going to tell when I began doing the research for this book, until I started to look actually at the people inside the story and who they were and what their lives were in this moment of 1948. So now we get to the lawyer. Today, if you talk to international human rights lawyers, they will often mention this man as one of their heroes, Hirsch Zvi Lauterpacht. He's considered to be the founding father of international human rights law. He's been called the greatest international lawyer of the 20th century. He's the man who coined the term crimes against humanity. He came up with much of the legal ideas that were used at Nuremberg to prosecute the Nazi war criminals. He came up with the idea of an international bill of human rights. And recently, a book came out from two Yale Law School professors who said not only was he important for international law and human rights, but he is the most important man in the last 3 centuries for thinking about liberalism because of his ideas about war and peace. So the question is, where did he get all of these amazing ideas from? Most lawyers and legal scholars will say, well, it's pretty clear where he got these from. He was a Jew from Poland who lost his family in the Holocaust, fled from anti-Semitic Europe, ended up in England, became a lawyer and a law professor, and went on to become a judge. And they will often say, because he was Jewish and persecuted, he therefore wanted to come up with something to help everybody. He stood for universal values because he'd suffered from the worst excesses of politics and nationalism. And he's often been explained as somebody, because he had no homeland of his own, because he was a diaspora refugee, he thought, let's get beyond nations and states and think about law as a way to protect everybody. Because he'd been ravaged by nationalism, he reached for internationalism. In short, he was a man without politics, just ethics and law, trying to make the world a better place and transcend the horrors he just experienced. And it's an interesting way to imagine him, and it kind of resonates the way we think about the Holocaust and human rights and universal values. The one problem with this, as I came to find out, is it's not true. That's not his story, in fact. He had these ideas, but his story begins 2 decades earlier, and it begins in a very different way. It turns out that the man who invented much of modern human rights law in 1948 also spent the same year drafting a version of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. The man who was thinking at the UN about international human rights and law wrote his first dissertation in law school about Zionism and about the British Mandate, in which he said that the British taking control of Palestine and promising it to the Jewish people was a victory for history, was a victory for international law, was a victory for rights. And the man who actually inspired much of the European Convention on Human Rights spent 2 decades as the legal advisor to the Jewish Agency, basically to the Zionist movement in Palestine. Even in 1948, as he's writing human rights and thinking about these legal ideas, he's giving legal advice to the Israeli government, the provisional government, about the war they're fighting against Arab forces and Palestinians and about what their legal strategy should be. So he was doing two things at once that we often imagine as very different, right? Nationalism, fighting for sovereignty, territory, and international law, human rights. It turns out that these things are not two sides of him, they're interconnected because his nationalism, his internationalism grow up together. And what I want to tell you about is how this happened and where all this story comes from. I'll just point out here what these things are. I'll explain them a little bit more. This is in the middle is a chunk of a document that was his draft of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. It was influential in that process, but it was not, for reasons I can go into, was not the final version because of a man named David Ben-Gurion who had his own ideas about what to do. And this is some Polish language writing of his, and this is an article about an organization he started, which I'll tell you about in a second. The story of Lauterpacht begins in Eastern Europe in 1918, and it begins with the pogrom in the aftermath of World War I, when Ukrainians and Poles are fighting for territory. They're basically crisscrossing a Jewish heartland, and Jews are getting caught in the middle. And in the city of Lviv, aka Lvov, aka Lemberg, present-day Ukraine, where Lauterpacht is a young man, there is a particularly vicious pogrom of Polish forces killing Jews. His response to that is to write a memorandum. And this is an interesting document in which he does not demand simply justice. He doesn't demand equality. He doesn't say stop the hatred. He doesn't say we want to go to Palestine. What he says is we want international minority rights. And what that means is that he says if we are going to be treated equally and fairly inside this emerging country, which is about to be declared Poland, he says we need to have citizenship and we need democracy, but we also need to be treated like a national minority. We need to have our own schools. We need to have our own rights to use our language, the rights to have our own religious system. And we need this recognized in law. We want civil rights, but we also want group rights for our people. And he said, this is the building block on which we can have justice here and in which we can be accepted and imagine a future for ourselves as Jews inside this emerging Polish society. So in other words, his goal was less to stop violence or just to achieve equality than it was to find a way to ensure the survival of what he understood to be a vulnerable minority group. And this meant asking for this whole set, this complex of group rights. He goes on to make a similar demand of universities across Europe. And so up here, first of all, this is in Polish. This is one of the resolutions, the demands that were issued at that time. And this is part of a larger campaign that he begins, and it's really what grows into an international legal campaign for what is known as international minority rights. This is a system of asking for group rights, and in my reading of the story, this is basically what we had before we had international human rights. This is what the League of Nations recognized in a set of treaties called the Minorities Treaties that required all of these different countries emerging after World War I, Poland, Lithuania, and other countries, to guarantee the rights of the minority groups and to give them certain legal protections. Of course, equality, but also, as I've mentioned, certain protections for their educational and legal and other provisions of their society. And Lauterpacht is part of this movement demanding this, but he also demands something else. He also demands that Jews be recognized as a nationality. And he says it's important that we be seen as a nation just like the Poles, just like the Lithuanians, just like the Germans and the Hungarians, even if we don't have a Jewish country here inside Europe where we live. He starts an organization right after that called the World Union of Jewish Students. It's still around today, and it's to fight for Jewish student rights and against anti-Semitism in European universities. And one of his first efforts is to go to the League of Nations, the precursor to the UN, and to say to them, you need to do something about anti-Semitism in European universities, about restrictions against Jews, about violence against Jews, and you need to do it, and you also need to admit us as a body to represent all of international Jewish students. So this is a demand to be heard, and these images up here are him and some of the coverage of the opening conference of this. And what is interesting about this moment and about what I'm describing is that he goes to these things and he says we're a nation, we're a nationality, and we're not asking for a country here, but we are asking for a country over there. He is a Zionist. And he says, in fact, if we have a country over there in Palestine, that will help Jews become a normal nation like other nations, but it doesn't mean we're all going to pour out of Europe and go there. We also want to be recognized as a national minority here. And this is a complicated thing for us to wrap our heads around, because many of us, when we think about Zionism, however we think about it, we say that Zionism is a story of Jews making a claim to a territory and building a country. And then what's left of Zionism means Jews supporting that country. But Zionism for him means more than that. It really means, as I frame it, two different things at once. No one imagined, not Vladimir Jabotinsky on the right, not Theodor Herzl or Chaim Weizmann in the center, not Ahad Ha'am and Zionists on the left, no one imagined that the Jews of Europe were all going to leave. Right? Everyone imagined that there would be an emerging homeland in the Middle East for Jews, but that many millions of Jews would remain in Europe. And those Jews would remain where they were mostly concentrated, which was in Eastern Europe. And therefore, they would claim the status of a national minority there, even as they were a national majority to be in Palestine. And so what emerges, and what we see in the activism of Lauterpacht and other people like them, is this kind of double model of saying the League of Nations is now going to order the world. It's going to give Jews the homeland that they want, and that is the British mandate in Palestine, and it's going to give them minority rights in the places in Eastern Europe where they are a minority. Lauterpacht thought that with the decline of empire, the nation state was rising, and the nation state was a good thing. It helped protect people. But you could never squeeze all people into the state in which they were the nation. There were always going to be minorities. So you were always going to need a legal system to protect them and to kind of come up with a way to let them be who they were and have their identity guarded and protected and recognized by law. And the two things actually would be simpatico, and they would complement each other. Because, as he said, we are not the only people like this. Right? There are millions of Germans living inside Poland after World War I. There are millions of Lithuanians living there, and there are Germans in Lithuania. And this messiness is okay as long as we also have a harmonious way to structure it. As a consequence, he goes on to develop these ideas and to say that the two things go hand in hand. Now, Lauterpacht is an interesting person because while he's doing this, as I mentioned, he's advising his Zionist friends in Palestine about how to declare a state, what to do, and he's rising up into a career in academia. He goes to the University of Cambridge and becomes a distinguished professor of international law. And he gets involved in all kinds of other things as they're developing, particularly over the course of the 1940s. He is the man who, because of his expertise, is dispatched early in the 1940s by the British Foreign Office to come here to the US and advise the Americans on certain legal affairs. One of the first things he does is meet with a man named Justice Robert Jackson and advise him about the Lend-Lease Act, how the US can support the war effort before it enters the war, before Pearl Harbor and all that. And then he goes on to advise Jackson and the Americans and the British about Nuremberg. He drafts some of the statements used by the British prosecutor to make his opening arguments. And he goes on to develop some of these legal ideas. Crimes against humanity is a new idea, how you can prosecute the Nazis for the crimes they did. He goes on from this, as I mentioned, to rise up to a judgeship, and he ends up as a judge on the International Court of Justice after World War II. Excuse me. And while he's doing that, he's also commenting and advising the UN about human rights and what that should look like. And then we get to 1948. In 1948, Lauterpacht is actually very optimistic initially about what's happening, because he sees now is the moment when that ordering of the world is going to happen for us. When he looks at Israel-Palestine, he says, okay, a partition is a necessary way to carve this up and create two states, just like in India and Pakistan. Empires are disappearing, and we're going to have this realm of states. We might even move towards something else afterwards, which is an interesting thing about what he imagined the world could look like in the future. But for the time being, he understood that what happens in Palestine is a normal process of building nation states. It's messy, but it can be done well with the rule of law and principle. Just like in India, you will divide it up and you'll build states there. And human rights also will be an orderly legal system to govern the world and to protect those minorities who live inside these states, Muslims inside India, Arabs inside Israel, Jews inside an Arab state, which was envisioned by many to be a reality that would emerge also. And yet 1948 produces a moment of triumph and a moment of crisis for Lauterpacht. And we can summarize it this way. Human rights begin to be created, but not in the way that he imagined. And he actually, over the course of 1948, turns into an early critic of the international human rights system. The critique was simply one in which we are talking about human rights, but we're not doing the much more practical thing of building an international legal system. And we should have done that first. If we create values and beautiful ideas, but without law to make them real, then that can be even more dangerous than if we just pass laws or don't do anything. Without equal buy-in from the different countries in this new international reality, you won't have a system that is free from politics. Now, interestingly enough, and I could say more about this, he's not alone in this critique. In fact, the person who best expresses a similar critique in this moment is the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who also says human rights actually don't mean anything unless you have a political system to protect them and a legal system to guard them. That is why, in fact, she says the Jews of the world lost their human rights under Nazism and got them back through Israel. And she goes on to critique Israel in ways that we'll see have to do with the gap between ideals and reality. So Lauterpacht, as you can see in this quote, he says specifically, right, if we could build an international human rights system now after World War II that was really effective and well designed, it would be very important for humanity. But you can't do it simply by saying human rights and by proclaiming it. And then he goes on to say, to a lawyer, the enunciation of a right without the provision of a remedy is a juridical heresy, right? You can't just proclaim rights unless there's a court you can go to, a place you can go, and a guarantee of those rights. What we need at this juncture is not the recognition and not even the formulation of inalienable human rights, but their effective protection by an instrumentality higher than the state itself. So in other words, he's saying the UN is now on the wrong track. What they are doing is proclaiming beautiful ideas of rights, but they're not making states, they're not requiring all the countries of the world to do this, which means they're kind of a free-floating signifier or just a set of words and ideals that we can use, but we can't enforce. And in fact, he says it would be better if we just had a very, very limited set of rights we all agreed on and that countries could agree on. Communist, capitalist, even empires and liberal nation states could all agree on this, then we would be better off. Don't enunciate all of these rights, the right to education, the right to health. Just start with one or two basic ones and a legal system that requires every state to respect them and to guarantee them, and then grow from there. This isn't what happens, and because of this, he begins to be even more critical about the dangers in the moment of 1948. So, as he says up here in this quote, we must guard the borderline between law and a most intractable problem of politics. Or human rights will become the object of diplomatic bargaining and political maneuvers. So he believes with all of his being that there ought to be basic universal rights for people and peoples, but he's very skeptical of what he's seeing. And when the Universal Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights is announced at the end of 1948, in December of that year, he begins to be even more publicly critical. He goes on the BBC and gives a radio address in which he says that this is basically a shanda. Right? He doesn't use that term, but it's an embarrassment. It's a terrible step backwards. It's clear to me that the Declaration does not carry things further and in some important respects has put the clock back. We will need to make a new start. Okay, so here's a man who deeply believes in international law but sees it as not legal enough and as flawed in that moment. What does he do? Well, he says there must be a way forward. He actually is an optimist. And he says there has to be a way to avoid these dangers. And he recognizes, he's a realist, so he recognizes, and he says at the time that one of the biggest problems is that his own country, meaning Great Britain, doesn't want to submit itself to the authority of the international human rights system. It loves the idea of having a declaration. It doesn't want its sovereignty infringed upon. The US does not, the Soviets do not. And so he says it's actually the great powers, it's their fault, because they're not really willing to let go of all the power in the UN and let international law rule over them. They love the idea of human rights as a way to deal with other countries, but they don't want it. So he's not someone who simply says America is right and other countries are wrong, or the UK is. He's critical of that, and he's realistic. He has a solution, however, and the solution takes the three forms, three solutions. Number one, he says, let's start over and start local. So he goes back to Europe and he says, let's build a human rights system just for Europe. We have a common heritage, we have a common system here, we're building a European market and eventually a European Union. And so Europe can get together and build its own human rights system, and it should start there. In fact, that is what happens, and Europe creates its own human rights legal system and its own human rights court, which begins to grow slowly. And he looks approvingly on this and says, this is good. Now every country of the world can do it, and we can kind of scale up from there, right? And he says, in fact, this is the way to do it. It's less political if you're all kind of in common agreement. African Union, South America, North America in theory, the Middle East in theory, but start with Europe, where we all talk about rights and democracy, and also we have a common enemy, which is communism to the east. So we can build this system together. That's one solution. A second solution is, he says, courts, right? So he goes on to become a judge on the International Court of Justice. That is not the same thing as the International Criminal Court, for those of you who follow these issues. It's a court that adjudicates conflicts between states, but he believes that judges are really important, and there are international judges at this forum, and he writes a whole book about impartiality. If we can make sure judges will be the people who will help protect us and enforce the law, because they can stand above the politics that often undermine these kinds of international legal affairs. So this is a picture of him, and next to him, I always love this shot because it's a picture of another judge who's clearly asleep during the arguments. Like, none of you are, good. So he goes on to the court, and he's very excited to be on the International Court of Justice. And he believes courts will be uniquely helpful for this process. And finally, there's one more thing which he says is very important. And here's where the stories I've been telling you kind of come full circle to where I began speaking about these issues at the beginning of the talk. The number one human right, the most important right, is the right of petition. In 1950, Lauterpacht goes to Israel. He spent a lot of time there. He thought about making Aliyah 2.5 decades earlier. He marries a woman from Jerusalem, so he has family there. He spends vacation time there, and he plans to retire there eventually. And he speaks beautiful Hebrew. And he goes and he gives 2 lectures in Jerusalem to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the founding of the Hebrew University. In fact, 25 years earlier, in 1925, he had been in Jerusalem himself with his wife, leading a delegation of 200 European Jewish students on what we could call the first birthright, for those of you familiar, right? It was a program that he organized with the World Union of Jewish Students to bring these Jewish students and show them Jerusalem. And they went on the occasion of the opening of the Hebrew University. And then 25 years later, he's back. And he goes and he gives these 2 lectures. And they're very interesting lectures because they're powerful lectures in which he's critiquing what's gone wrong with human rights. But there's also a message, a subtext, which is directed at Israel itself. And in his speech, he says, the great powers have kind of made a muck of human rights because they wouldn't really enforce, they wouldn't commit to the law and the legal system that they kept talking about. So now we have a universal declaration, which doesn't mean anything. It doesn't give you anything. So what we really need, and the first human right, the most important thing, has to be the right for an individual who is threatened or discriminated against, if his or her own government won't do anything, to go over the heads of the government to an international organization like the UN and to petition them to investigate and do something. So even if we don't have a law that can force a government to respect the rights of its citizens, if we at least have a way to go over the heads of that government and tell somebody to do something about it. And he says in this speech, which he makes in Hebrew, the right of petition by individuals is the essence of international protection of human rights. That has to come before anything else. This was a live issue at the time because the United Nations had begun to try and develop a program of addressing this question of individual petition. What does that mean? Already from 1946 onwards, people around the world begin to write letters to the UN. Once they know there's a UN, and they begin to write letters, and the letters are testimonials from people saying, I'm suffering, my human rights are being violated by my government in Poland, in China, in Greece, all over the place. Thousands upon thousands of letters are arriving every month from 1946 onwards. And you know what happens to the letters? Nothing. They are locked up in an archive, and the Commission on Human Rights decides that we don't have the legal authority to investigate and open these complaints because no one gave us that legal authority when they built the UN. And people like Lauterpacht say this is a catastrophe and this is absurd, right? People are literally writing from around the world saying, do something, or at least tell my story. And the UN officials, and including diplomats from many countries who would say we care about human rights, are not opening the letters. Because it turns out that Greece doesn't want the letters open in case it makes Greece look bad. And the US doesn't want them open because it might make the US look bad. So what Lauterpacht says when he gets to Jerusalem is, to his old Zionist comrades, Israel should take the lead in changing the rules so we can read these petitions and creating a right of petition for people around the world. Israel, after all, is a Jewish nation state. We're committed to human rights. Israel should be the first ones to do this, and they should go to the UN and they should champion this cause. And the response he gets from his old friends, who are now prominent officials in the Israeli government, is, you're out of your mind, right? We can't afford to. And they say to him, we've been with you all along, but we live in a dangerous neighborhood. We're still fighting a war. We don't have real peace with our neighbors. We cannot afford to do it. Security must trump that. That's not our role to do that. And we're not going to be Nachshon, right, to use a Torah reference. We're not going to be the first people to jump into this sea of this new experiments with human rights. We can't afford to do it. And he writes back and he says, because this is by this time he's left, gone home, he writes back, he goes, it's not for me to judge what your security needs are. You know better than me, but I'm disappointed. I would like Israel to be able to do this, and I think you can afford to do this, and if you do it, I think other people will follow. So they say you're naive. He says, maybe I don't know everything, but I think you have more capacity to move forward and move the world forward than you think. So who was naive? That's the question I want to leave you with. We're still living in that moment, right? In a lot of senses. We're still living in 1948. We're still having this discussion and this argument about human rights in Israel and Zionism, right? What Israel should do. Does it do more than enough? Does it do hardly enough? Should it be judged more than other countries? How should we view it? And this is basically the argument that Lauterpacht is having at that moment with his friends, his fellow Zionists. We're certainly also in that moment because what we've seen since that time is human rights has really grown incredibly successful as a language, a moral language for our world, right? And we now use it to talk about all kinds of other things and all kinds of claims to justice. But it's nevertheless remained really in the realm of norms, not law, right? So the way in which much of the work of human rights gets done today is by naming and shaming human rights abuses, by putting pressure, and organizations that work in it often try and shine a spotlight and tell the world what's happening in order to pressure countries into doing stuff. The law has not kept pace. And much of the vision that Lauterpacht and others had of law that could really give individuals a way to go right to the UN and claim their rights and have a neutral organization to kind of enforce them hasn't happened. His dream that the courts would be a way to have a neutral venue also hasn't happened. We have an international criminal court, which didn't exist back then. And in theory, it's a court which can be the referee on human rights issues. For those of you who follow the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's safe to say that is a jurisdiction which is incredibly contested, right? And some view it as de facto anti-Semitic. Others view it as enforcing the law, but powerless to actually change Israel's state behavior. Strikingly, and I always have to remind myself and others, it's not all about Jews, right? Around the world, right? In Africa, many countries now view the ICC as a colonial court that is about politics and not really promoting human rights. And others say, no, you regimes just don't want to cooperate with this court. So Lauterpacht's dream that courts would be the place to save it hasn't happened, and we're still kind of revolving around that set of questions. We're also still living in 1948 because he made an assumption, and an assumption proved wrong. He imagined that the division of the world into nation states would produce a Palestinian state. That was his assumption. It was an assumption of many Zionists back then. Regardless of all the politics and the war and all the things that happened, the assumption was there are going to be two states. And of course, as we know, they're not two states, right? So much of the problem with it is when Israelis and Palestinians clash, you have a state and you have a stateless people. And then the questions that we grapple with are, how do we evaluate the conduct of a terrorist group versus a government? What do human rights mean in these different situations? It wasn't supposed to be this way in Lauterpacht's vision. But there is one difference, and I'm going to leave you with a reflection on this one difference between that world and our world today. And that's the title of this lecture, which is Double Amnesia. The one thing that we have seen happen is basically people have forgotten this story, right? We've forgotten that kind of Zionism and human rights traveled this road up to World War II and into 1948 together. And there was a shared path inside that, which had to do with nationalism and internationalism, universalism and particularism, these isms actually connected to one another rather than seen as clashing. And we've forgotten this, and that's as a result, I think we have a polarization of how we even think about these things and how we think about what's possible, because we see them as destined to clash. And so that makes the partisans of human rights see every nationalism somehow as evil incarnate, and the partisans of nationalism now see human rights somehow as a global conspiracy that is one way or another going to undermine the nation state and its security. We can't go back in time, but we also can't move forward if we don't grapple with exactly how we got here. And so the hope with this past double anniversary is we can begin to think about this and think about other ways forward. And I'm going to leave you just with this image. It's a striking image. In 1958, Lauterpacht's friends in the Israeli government, in the foreign ministry, were involved in issuing this postage stamp, right? And if you read the Hebrew, it's ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This was to commemorate the 10th anniversary of international human rights. Israel faced big challenges then, right? And it faced internal and external challenges. Suez had just happened. It was totally unclear what was going to happen. Nasser and Pan-Arabism was intensifying. Nevertheless, they saw themselves as leaders in this international human rights world. And they could imagine a role for Zionism and human rights which was quite different than the one that we've arrived at today. So it's a suggestion that things often moved in different ways than we imagine, and therefore perhaps they might once more do so. Thank you very much. So I would be happy to take questions if there are any. Yes, please.
How can the world move forward unless you have leaders who are willing to go to bat for this thing, America first, without leadership to show the way? I don't think it can happen from the ground up.
Right. So I'll repeat the question. The question was about leadership. How can you make any progress in the world without leaders? People of courage, right? People willing to take risks, people willing to make harder choices and push forward, if I'm not putting words in your mouth. And the answer is, I'm an historian, so I don't know. I could just tell you how we got here. No, I will tell you something. What was striking in researching this book, and this is a book about 5 people, 5 men, and I wanted to write about individuals because sometimes we tell the story of groups and organizations and parties, and this and that. But people can do it. These were just people who got up and said, let's build a country. Let's reinvent international law, right? So I think we have those people today too. We just kind of need to give them our encouragement and our support. We do need them, right? And historians often today will say, well, it's about large forces, populism, right? Economics, it's these things are pushing, and then cynical people just manipulate them. But it does come back to leaders. It does come back to people being willing to step forward and take those risks. So I don't have the solution to that, but I do think those people are out there, and they will do it if we can give them the resources to imagine ways forward instead of having to capitulate to the forces that are acting on us. Yeah.
I have a question about 1918, not 1940.
Yeah.
Loeffler writing this book or this declaration where he makes the claim for the state but also the protection of minority rights. I was just wondering, because at that time, through the Versailles Treaty, later on, all these countries that came into existence, like Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Lithuania, based their claims on the 14 points by
Wilson, yeah.
Was that actually part of his argument, or has that ever been part of the also protection of the minority right, or being a nation within?
It was. So just to amplify the question, 1918, right, is the story also of Woodrow Wilson proclaiming national self-determination and saying that we want a world of democracies and that we're going to give some protections to minorities. So that was in there. Wilson, it's an interesting story of Wilson's vision, and what Wilson confronted was a messy map of Europe where they told him, no, you can't just create these countries. You're still going to have millions of people on the quote-unquote wrong side of the border, right? So Wilson himself wasn't per se interested in minority rights, language, culture, but he quickly understood that this is a way to solve some of the problem of engineering new nation states. And that was part of it. The key thing about it was, and this is the nasty part of the story, right, which is it's all premised on reciprocity, right, a kind of balance of this. So, the joke in Geneva was that, the Germans protect the Hungarians protect the Germans, and they both beat their Jewish communities, right? Because the Jews are this archetypal minority who are not a group somewhere. And for Germany, Weimar Germany becomes a protector of the ethnic Germans who live in all these countries. So in the book I talk about, it turns out the most successful alliance for Lauterpacht and these other people in the 20s and 30s was between Jews and Germans, because these were the two big diaspora minority groups in Europe. And they would both together go to the League of Nations and advocate on behalf of minorities. The difference was that the Germans had a country called Germany that could represent them, and the Jews didn't have a country. That is why Lauterpacht, in my reading, wanted a Jewish homeland, right? He was a Zionist. He identified with Hebrew and the rebirth of Jewish nationhood, but he felt that will make us normal, and that reciprocity is what's going to allow us to do it. Now, reciprocity can become a trap, right? And that is also what happened, not just for Jews, but for other national minorities in Europe, right? It can exacerbate those tensions. And it can also lead to ideas that maybe we need to therefore adjust the numbers, right? And nowadays we understand the strange ways in which Wilson's vision also required millions of people to be kicked across the borders from Greece to Turkey and other places. And this is also what happened after World War II, where Czechoslovakia will say, oh, we just need to get rid of some of these people to build our nation state. And Poland will do the same, and then you can begin to understand this messiness that comes out of this impulse to try and organize stuff. But that's a long answer to your question of simply saying, yeah, it is part of that Wilsonian moment as we describe it. Yeah. Please, Bruno.
It's not really a question. I just wonder if you are familiar with the figure of Stefan Hessel, who was, legend says that he was part of the people who wrote the Universal Declaration of 1948. And he turned out at the end of his life in his 90s, a few years ago, very, very anti-Israel.
Oh, yeah.
He's just a very interesting figure, actually,
to look at.
In the context of,
yes.
Of this tension.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that name. I didn't investigate in the book. I did investigate somebody else who's well-known, René Cassin, who was another French figure. And one of the interesting things for me, again, was that in 1948, Cassin's one of the people. He's a French Jew. He's a hero. He's close with de Gaulle. And he is one of the people, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, creating this Universal Declaration. Right? I'll just go back and put it up here. Here's Eleanor Roosevelt with the Declaration. And Cassin, he's a complicated person. But while he's doing that, he's also arguing with the Lebanese delegate, Charles Malik, who is a Lebanese Christian, very important man also in this story. And they're arguing about Israel. So one of the interesting things is the arguments are there even back then, right, among these people about Israel, about what's going on, even as they're building human rights. Sometimes I think we imagine that everything was, simpatico then, and then only afterwards when this or that. But they were building it, and I think maybe I'll leave you all with this thought. One of the inspiring things about this is these are people who were pushing through very clear ideological differences still to imagine something positive emerging from this moment. They didn't sort of say politics is the enemy, right? They actually conflicted, but they said, how can we contain that conflict and imagine designing law in a way that will help us? So to me, that is one of the important lessons that does emerge from this tangled story of 1948. Yeah. Should we wrap it up? Yeah. Thank you very much.